Hey everybody, welcome to our very first area workshop. My name is Amanda and I'm a community and content manager for media and entertainment at Autodesk. Today you'll be hearing from Logan Foster, who's a 3ds Max product owner, and he'll be walking you through the ins and outs and best practices of UV unwrapping, which is everyone's favorite part of asset development. And he'll be joined by Bruno Landry and Sean Olson, also from the 3ds Max team, who will be answering your questions. So we've got a few key resources for you here. Just to be in the loop of everything that's new at 3ds Max, you can find everything about the latest updates on makeanything.autodesk.com. You can follow us on social media at these channels here. And if you want to be part of our beta program, you can sign up at feedback.autodesk.com and be a part of the development with the team. And of course, we'll be hosting more events like this in the near future. So follow us along at area.autodesk.com to stay in the loop there. So a few ground rules before I hand it over to Logan. If there are any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, please bear with us as we're all working from home. And if you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, please ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of this window. Our team will be answering your questions throughout. And please hang around at the end. We've got a survey that we'd really appreciate if you give us some feedback. And aside from that, you can expect an email with the recording to go out in a few days after this. So without further ado, let's get started and handing it over to Logan.
Hi, everybody. My name is Logan Foster. I'm one of the product owners for 3ds Max here at Autodesk. And I'm also one of those rare people that I like to jokingly say loves UVs. And so this passion of mine for UVs is something that I've loved to share with other people. I've done this presentation to the Max team, to other professionals, to artists and community groups, and I'm very happy to share it to you. I literally wanted to call it something a little fun, a little fresh, that UVs, that friend you wish you could better understand, because I think that we all get into a situation where we know that we need UVs, we want to like UVs, but we just don't quite get it. And hopefully with this webinar series, you guys will get a little bit more of an understanding out of it and have a better experience working with UVs and moving forward in the future. So just a quick introduction. This webinar is totally based on my own process. It's, as everything with Max and everything you do in 3D, ensure that you always adopt it to whatever works best for you. You're going to find bits and pieces that you're going to like, or maybe you're going to find things you want to do a little differently. Feel free to please, adopt it to how you want to work and how you look at it. I know for a lot of people, when I talk about UVs, they often feel that it's really difficult and it's sometimes intimidating or scary. I often like to think of it as an easy and fun thing to do, but also because I've been doing it for 15, 16 years now, that I do find it very easy and fun. So I can get that it can be hard for people to kind of grasp how this works. For myself, what I like to recommend is think of it like a puzzle. And also what helps when you're working with UVs is think about how you maybe would paint or apply the detail onto your model. These are kind of two aspects that, I think really right away are sort of like fundamental ground rules that are going to help you out when you want to think about UVs here. Keep in mind as well, there's always productivity enhancements coming out. When I was taught this in 2004 from my mentor, this would take me days to do UVs. And if you think about 2004 working on games, you maybe had 1,000, maybe 2,000 triangles that you're working with. A couple of days is a pretty intensive time period. Nowadays, there's been a lot of productivity enhancements inside of 3ds Max and from third-party tools or plugins for Max that make this process much quicker, much faster. So really, it's nothing that should take you more than a few hours once you get comfortable and kind of understand the workflows and what's going on. And of course, we're going to look at this as well, that, there's different tools going on here. We ship lots of stuff in the software. We're always having fixes and updates. If you guys have any problems, anything that goes on, we will, let us know. We always want to make the software bigger, faster, better, and we'll go from there. Okay, so really quick introduction. What the heck are UVs? This is kind of one thing that people often ask quite a lot. UVs are just basically a way of saying XYZ coordinates for mapping, right? We only call them UVWs simply for the sake of not making them confusing when we're talking about them to other people. So really when people say UVWs, they mean XYZ. Often people will just refer to them as U and V simply because it's X and Y axes that you're mapping. And the Z is basically translated to W or depth. When we're thinking about UVs, the way I really like to equate it or think about it, or how people think about it, is this idea that it's 3D data flattened to 2D space. So some of you guys have probably done papercraft before, papercraft exercises. It's basically the reverse. So instead of taking the flat piece of paper, folding it up and making it into a 3D object, we're doing the reverse, where we're taking the 3D object and we're trying to flatten and flay it out until it's relatively flat and without distortions. And of course, UVs are a pretty critical part of the art production pipeline, regardless of which industry segment that you're in. So it doesn't matter if you're doing film, games, or design viz, or even anything in between with regards to mobile, VR, AR, even WebGL and 3D commerce that we're starting to see emerging. It's all important for UVs to be a part of this process, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. So it's still a critical thing to learn and take care of. So like I said, let's look at a real world example. I know there's the example out there of the Santa wrapped with the tinfoil wrapper. How I like to kind of explain it though is thinking of like an orange. So as a kid, we all grew up, we probably had these Christmas oranges that would come out. They're the small peelable oranges. And as a kid, you know, I would be bored eating lunch at school, and I would kind of try to like peel this thing apart and do it in different ways, right? And UVs is very similar, in my opinion, on how you would like unpeel an orange, right? There's lots of ways you can unpeel an orange, but it's how what you want to get at the end that's important, right? Do you break it up into little chunks, little segments, or do you try to split it apart into one large continuous piece? If you've ever done this as kind of an exercise out of sheer boredom or I guess fun, you would maybe get something that looks a little bit like this. So peeling the orange apart, getting the skin or the wrapping off the outside of it. And of course, when it's completely flayed out, we get something like this, something that's a little bit fun that we can start to play with and go with. So one of the big things that usually comes to people when they start thinking about UVs and textures is what comes first? Do I unwrap my model and then texture my work, or do I do my texture first, or get my image and my content out of my image application that I'm working with, and do I apply that to my model? And this is always one that kind of like confuses people, especially if they're not experienced with UVs. But even if they are experienced, they can still throw them for a loop because there is no best way to do it. So we've all seen the idea of the chicken and the egg. So what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? You can't have a chicken without an egg, but if there's no chickens around, what lays the egg? This is that kind of conundrum that people get into when they start thinking about UVs and textures and what process, which order to do them in. And for me, when I like to explain this for UVs, I like to explain it in breaking it down into two ideas. One is called explicit UVs. This is basically where you make the UVs and then you use the UVs that you built as kind of like a template or a coloring book that you would use to map and to do your textures on. And the other one is this idea of trim sheets. So you basically create the texture and you work on it and you make it look really good. Either it's photo reference or it's something that you've painted up in an application. And then you arrange your UVs from your model to fit the results as best possible. And what's really important to note is that neither method is right or wrong. To me, it really all depends on the need that you're working with. And we're gonna go take a look at a couple of these methods really quickly here. So the first example, explicit UVs. With explicit UVs, this is kind of typically what you see a lot when people start thinking about UVs and UV coordinates, right? Each face has its own set of UV coordinates. Everything's explicitly mapped. Typically, most things aren't overlapped. They all have their own unique space that they occupy in the 3D world. And for the artists out there, you're basically using the UVs and the unflayed, unflattened version of your model to be a coloring book, to paint and put texture and detail and specific information on specific pixels to specific locations on your 3D model, your 3D map. This is the type of workflow we're going to be talking about in the rest of this webinar series today. So it's kind of important to kind of note what's going on here, right? And what we see with this type of workflow as well is this is really used for things that we see like characters, items, and props inside of our games or our movies or our VR environments, and all of our uses. This is very, like I said, very, very common for a lot of people to have and to use is to have mapping coordinates in this way. And of course, it offers fantastic control because you can decide as the artist what is going to go where, what is going to show on this spot, on this location, put fine touches and put like a really cool artistic look and touch and feel onto your model that makes it feel unique and different. The downfall of doing explicit UVs though is of course your model as it gets flattened out needs to occupy space on your texture, and you are limited by how many pixels can actually be shown on for a particular part of your model, right? And it's dependent upon the size of the bitmaps that you have. And unfortunately, we can't have unlimited bitmap sizes. So bitmaps, of course, take up memory, and this is one of those constraints that we really got to be careful about when we're thinking about explicit UVs, is how do things map in and how do they not map in? And this is where the idea of trim sheets kind of comes in play. Trim sheets is something you normally see with environment objects and very large objects. So if you've played a lot of MMOs, first-person shooter games, things like that, even a lot of film and VFX will use this idea of a trim sheet or UDIMs to, in some cases, to also handle how do you map a continuous tiling bitmap onto specific coordinates. And the whole idea of a trim sheet is really you're just kind of using the texture information that exists that's been built for you. Maybe it's photo reference, maybe it's something else. And you're taking the faces from your model, you're turning those into UVs, and you're explicitly putting them onto specific areas of the map. So in the case that I've got here as the example, this little crane robot guy that I had built, he was entirely built out of these 4 bitmap textures that are on there. And honestly, looking back at this, I could probably even done it with less, but the point is that you're reusing your textures and your texture information over and over and over again, where and how you feel that it's going to fit in. Your UVs will overlap. This is perfectly fine in this type of case usage, because you're not trying to explicitly map information from specific locations to other specific locations, right? You're basically sharing and reusing and trying to be ultra efficient with your texture space, your memory, and your UV coordinates to make something work. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered those basic rules, let's start talking about how I make UVs and how I would maybe recommend making UVs if you're brand new at this or you're experienced, or maybe you're looking for some tips, some tricks, some feedback on how to look at this kind of stuff. So when we're looking at creating UVs, there's a couple ways that can go about it. One of the more common or more popular ways that we see right now is this idea of like automatic generation, right? There's tons of tools out there that do automatic generation. We've got automatic generation of UVs existing in 3ds Max essentially since the unwrap UVW modifier shipped in Max 5. And the idea here is that you're kind of using the software, some algorithms to figure out how and where you want to flatten or flay out your map and your meshing that goes on with it, right? So what is great about flatten UVs and then these automatic methods is that, there's this misconception out there that UVs are hard to do. So people will just want to often refer to just using an automatic method to generate their UVs up for them. This is sometimes great because, as artists, we all love efficiency. We love having more time to actually do things that we feel is artistically oriented. So that could be, doing more modeling, doing some animation, texturing, things like that. UVs are kind of seen more as a bit of a technical aspect and feel out of it. So artists will often really love to have an automatic method out there. And of course, there's a lot of benefits as well if you've got pipeline automation. So there's a lot of feature films that have been looking to help automate and speed up their process by actually setting their models that they're building, having them auto unwrap and pulling it back in and things like that. But there's a problem that I often find with automatic generation, and I haven't really ever found a solution out there on the market yet that really says, it does perfect all the time. So for me, this is where I have this comment of ignorance is not bliss. Yes, these automatic generation methods will go and they will flatten your model out and they will give you a result. And this result, such as the one you see on the screen here, is perfectly acceptable. It looks great into what's going on. They're UV coordinates, but they're not coordinates that you actually want to use. If you tried to share this off to your texture artist, or you try to take this into a painting application of your choice, you probably have a real tough time trying to work with it, right? So it's really important, in my opinion, to know what's a good and usable UV before you start relying on automation tools to help you out. And really the problem is that algorithms only do what they're told to do. So that's how they're going to go. So what you often see going on with a lot of artists, especially in the games industry, is this idea of handcrafted, or I like to jokingly call them artisan UVs. And the idea out there is that there's a perception that you get the best UV coordinates by manually creating them. So you specifically taking the time to have control and specify which areas are going to be worked with, and using that to kind of augment the automation tool to drive and improve and speed up your output results, right? It's also really important as well. So before I joined Autodesk, I was working as a games artist and also as an instructor, teaching 3D modeling. And one of the core aspects that you saw a lot of people, a lot of hiring agents wanting to have at studios was that you needed to show that you can understand the UV process. So as great as automation methods are and tools that are out there, showing that you understood how to UV and be a part of that pipeline was still a critical part of actually getting a job and maintaining a job in this industry. So it's worth it. I know it's going to look consuming and intimidating, but it is really worth it in the end to start thinking about how can you hand stitch your UVs. And I would be remiss if I'm not going to talk a little bit about this idea of UV-less texturing. We're starting to see UV-less texturing, which is basically textures built on shaders and shader graph and shader information. So we see triplanar bitmap projections becoming really popular. In Max, we call this the blended box map. OSL has a lot of fantastic methods for doing UV-less texture application and application on your models. There's PTEX, there's a lot of other tools out there. And these are becoming more and more popular. So they're becoming out there. But there's a couple caveats that you always need to be aware of with them, right? One is that they are, of course, more expensive to calculate and process because the shader needs to actively look at the model and the mesh and then figure out how to calculate and how to try to assume where UVs are going to be and how to map the model on there so it's not going to be distorted. You do sometimes lack a fine degree of control where things are going to go and how they're going to get placed. You certainly lack this ability at this time to do a high to low bake, which is very popular. So taking a high resolution model, baking it down to the low resolution model, using the UV coordinates to create texture maps for it that hold extra mesh and model information for more efficient playback and display. And we're also seeing that UV-less texturing isn't quite ready yet for things like mobile and XR applications. And this is due partly with how the rendering engines are and that they're using a forward rendering mode as opposed to a deferred rendering mode that we see in kind of modern PC and console kind of titles. Okay, so let's get into the process. And then once I've gone through the process, I'm going to switch into Max. We're going to do a live demo. I'm going to have Bruno and Sean here to kind of ask questions, keep us entertained with some comments, and we'll have a nice interactive time here. Okay. So generating UVs, there are, to me, before you really start getting into the UV process itself, the one last final thing you need to think about is, are there any artistic or technical requirements that are a part of what you're doing, what you need to do, right? So think about things like, what are you making? How is it in the world? Is this a large object? Is it a small object? Is it an interactive object? Is it something that we're going to be able to view from multiple angles? How are we going to see it? These are really important things to know because how the object exists in the world or the application that it's going to be applied to can really dictate where you're going to think about putting seams and edges and where you're going to naturally try to focus more detail on your UVs and where you're going to have less detail on your UVs. So you want to think about what you're making. So how is it going to be applied? You're going to want to think about how many bitmaps can you use. So some applications that you're working on might have a limitation of one per object. Others might allow you to have multiple objects per map. So you might have multiple objects you have to share one single bitmap like you see with a trim sheet, or in mobile you see this as atlases. But you also might have this ability on the flip side of having multiple textures being operated on for your models, right? And this can typically work pretty good, but when you're thinking about a real-time application like games, having multiple textures on a model can actually be a little bit detrimental to the performance of the application because each texture becomes, on the model that's applied, becomes a different draw call, right? So you're starting to talk about performance hits and things like that. So there are some kind of technical limitations you need to start thinking about. You also have to think about, like, can you tile and repeat or mirror your UV data or not, right? You know, do you need to add any extra edge loops? Do you need to make any adjustments to your model to make the texturing easier? This is a really important thing to consider and think about, because sometimes having a really good, clean model is kind of the basis that will really make your life and your experience with unwrapping and making UVs so much easier. And the other thing you got to think about is, are there any technical requirements from your art director? So everyone's going to have an art director on their project. You know, it might be yourself, but typically it'll be someone a little bit more senior above you. And you're going to go from there. So a quick question that popped up about people asking what UDIMs are. UDIMs are basically, I'm going to try to cover this a little bit later on in the course, but UDIMs are just basically a way of having multiple maps mapped to multiple UV spaces, and we'll explain that in a little bit. So what I look at about my process when I'm doing UVs, when I generate my UVs, it's basically 6 steps. So generate, relax, check for distortions. I'm going to stitch and resize. I'm going to pack, and I'm going to export. And like I said, this has basically been the same process I used since 2004. It's just that the tools have gotten better, more efficient to help make this a faster process. So it's something that I've worked with for a long time, and hopefully you guys will find a lot of value and a lot of benefit from. So my typical step 1, generating UV coordinates. There's tons of tools that exist out there to flatten the UV data. The catch that you need to keep in mind is you're never, ever going to get a perfect result likely that has your mesh unwrapping and unflaying out to one perfect seamless piece. You're almost always going to be guaranteed to have multiple UV parts and pieces. These are often called UV shells or UV islands. And this is just going to be one of those things you have to have if you want to maintain a distortion-free, good UV set of coordinates. So what I try to do when I'm generating my coordinates is I try to break the mesh up itself using the UV tools. And I exclusively use the unwrap UVW modifier for this. So what I'm looking at doing is I'm trying to make like face selections, and I'm looking at minimal surface changes. So when you look at the sample model I've used on the left from a model I built here, I was taking this sort of like fin off the dragon's head, and I was looking at it and saying, okay, what's a fairly flat piece here? What can I map and kind of create a minimal distortion, because it's got minimal surface changes to it, right? So I'm trying to think about flat areas and shapes that I can make selections from and use. And I'm trying to make certain that this is kind of a line that the selection that you see here, so this square that's showing the gizmo inside a max, that this is generally aligned to the average selection of what's going on in my mesh. This is just going to help out with the output and the results, and that's going to be great. I'm also going to look for things like, where are creases, where are folds, where are hard edges. These are going to be really important because I can use all of these areas to be natural seams on my mesh. When you're breaking up your UVs, and like I said, you've got to break it up. More than likely or not, you're going to have to break it up into multiple parts and pieces. Having the seams broken up in these areas that are hidden or seem natural to the mesh will make your texture, your mapping, look natural to the result that's going on here. What you really want to avoid happening, though, is you want to avoid having seams being on flat surfaces or surfaces that are going to be really noticeable. When this happens, this is where we see in a lot of projects, especially real-time work, that there's a misalignment of the pixels, and it's a lot harder for you to make it seamless, to make it look natural and clean. And 3ds Max has some really cool seaming tools that can actually help you with this selection process to define areas and selections and turn them over into mapping coordinates that you can then generate from. And this is where having really good clean edge loops can come in handy, because the seam tools can work with your edge loop selection inside of Max and build up and go from there. And what you might find at this very first process as you're working with it is that there might be odd errors in the model. So you might have edge loops that don't terminate on their start points. They might actually wind and loop around. You might have areas where you're like, oh, I need to have an extra edge loop here because it's going to help me map this texture better. You might find as you're working on the selection and this generating the coordinates that if there is a problem making a selection, that you maybe need to stop, go back, make some fixes to the model. This might be just inserting new edge loops, or using the connect tool between a couple of vertices to insert a new edge along where a normal tri-face would be. Things like that to fix your mesh up, make it easier to generate, make it easier to work with. Once you get the results generated, you want to relax the results. So I call this relaxing. There's a lot of different terms and terminologies and even tools that are out there for it. It seems like every 3D application on the market, and as well as all the third-party ones coming in, we're always generating up new algorithms to do this relaxing. So in Max, you might see this called PELT or Peel or LSCM or even relax mapping. There's tons of different names and other third-party add-ons for 3ds Max that are out there. They all are essentially trying to do the same thing. The software is attempting to flatten or average out the results so that you can turn your input that you generated into a result that's flattened out and has minimal distortion to it. And this is something that we can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. So in this example of this character model, I'd taken it and I'd used the seaming tool inside of Max to actually map a seam going just from the forehead all the way down the top of the head and the base of the neck. And so when I was able to do that, I could generate the face coordinates, and it gave me this result, because this is the planar result that I got from doing the generate UVs options in Max. But because I had the seam built into it, and I added a few more stitches, seams elsewhere, so you can kind of see them right here, I was able to actually just use the peel system within Max to do a relax or an averaging, and it unflayed and flattened out the model until I got something that was what you kind of see here in this bottom example. What you're really trying to do is you're trying to reduce distortions with the relaxing, right? You're really trying to make certain that your model is clean and looks fairly good, right? So distortions will help ensure that your pixel information looks correct. It's not smeared, it's not distorted, it's not having any kind of issues that would make things look abnormal or warped or anything that's wrong with it. You can, of course, if you wanted to, go very slowly and manually kind of grab the planes and stitch them together and stitch them together and stitch them together. But often that's a slow process. So this is where the peeling, the relax algorithms can really help give you a better result on it. But you have to keep in mind that sometimes, you might have to go back and add more breaks and more seams to the model to get an output. So you'll have to just kind of keep your eye on things and look and whether or not it's working or not. So typically you can tell if it fails, if it's overlapped, like you see here in the first image where you've got UV coordinates kind of like mashed on top of each other and there's going to be massive distortions going on. That is a problem and you need to fix that up. But typically using more seams or inside of the edit UV window, using the break function on an edge can actually help kind of break it apart and release some tension on the mesh itself so that when it relaxes, it will give you the result that you want to have and you want to need.
Logan, so there's a question about if there's an option in Max to show the tension in the UVs. Do you know if that's possible?
There's a way to see the distortion in the pull down menu. We can show that when we get into Max itself, but if you guys can, this is the edit window right here. So where you can assign the checker map, there's actually a way to display the distortion as well that's going on.
Right.
Usually what I like to use is I'll use the checker map to kind of help me understand the distortion that's happening, which is going to be the next part of the slide. And I'll go on to that, so it's a great segue to go into there. So the checker results that you kind of see that come with 3D applications like Max, these look kind of silly when you think about them. You're like, oh, cool, it's a checker map or it's a color map, or, in the previous example we saw here, it's a grid with blue and green and it's got some numbers on it.
And that's a new one, is it? I think
yeah, this is the new one that we put into Max 2021. So yeah. So that's what you're seeing there. So the new one is higher resolution, so it's going to be a little bit more accurate in regards to like the pixel accuracy that you're seeing in the distortions that's going on.
And you'd be surprised how much. So we developed this one like based on user feedback, and it was surprising how much like beta user had like opinion about that checker pattern. It was quite fascinating.
It was, yes. But what you're doing with this checker pattern really is you're applying them, and it doesn't matter if it's a black and white. The color ones are a little bit better because sometimes they've got just a little bit more information on them, or they usually have numbers written on them. What you're really doing is you're using this checker map, you're applying it, and you're kind of using this to look for distortion. So this kind of gets back to that previous question you're asking, Bruno, about, like is there a way to check for the distortions? The checker maps are kind of the easiest, most visual way that I found to check for these distortions, because really if the checker pattern isn't square or near a perfect square, if the text that you're seeing displayed on the color pattern, if it's warped or it's it distorts or it's not uniform and even between each of the visual displays of the letters and the numbers going on here, this is a pretty good indication that you've got a distortion going on, right? Distortions basically will create like the idea of a smear or a stretch or kind of some sort of visual problem that's going on with your mesh, right? And this is where the color pattern works a little bit better, because you can really see a little bit more about like individual pixels and how they're going to like smear and stretch out, and they'll do a lot of weird, crazy things, and you'll see them in there. What's really important though is to note that it's probably going to be impossible to have a distortion-free, perfect flattened map that also is kind of logical and visual for you to understand what's going on with the UVs. So in my opinion, you know, you're not going to be 100% distortion free. You're really just kind of trying to aim for distortion minimal, so something that works. So in this example here on the left-hand side, you can see with this black and white checker map, the squares aren't perfect. You know, they're not perfect squares. There's a little bit of distortion to them. So like this one's a little bit wider than up here, but the distortion itself is fairly minimal, that it's not going to really skew or distort the individual pixels that are being applied and make up that kind of face. And you'll see these right away. They'll usually stand out like a sore thumb when you're using the checker patterns. So hopefully that kind of answers the question about looking for distortions and visualizing them. But we'll look at them a bit more inside of Max as well. Right after this step, I kind of added an extra optional option here. One thing that I try to do, I like to do is a personal thing. This isn't a necessary step. I try to think about the size and the orientation of it. So my own personal preference when I'm doing UVs is I try to align everything so everything's aligned sort of left to right, top to bottom on my model. So I'm trying to think about how is the model going to be lined up in the real world and applying that to my texture. And the reason why I find this works out really well, especially when I was painting textures, but if you're using like third-party painting applications as well, is that, you know, often your lighting information or your, you know, if you've got a gradient or you're trying to hand paint something on there, it makes it much easier to think about the lights coming from one uniform location on your map. And this is something that, you know, when you're doing fine arts, you'll often put little marks on your page to kind of like indicate or dictate where the lighting is coming from. This might be the same case when you're working with, let's say, gradients and things like that, where having your UVs lined up and thinking about having them lined up can maybe just make your life a little bit easier when you are when you're lining everything, you know, trying to get your texturing going and making it look right. This is just one of those optional things, but it's something that I kind of like to recommend that people think about doing, just because it'll make their life a lot easier. And this will also help you figure out things like the size or the scale. So sometimes people call this like texel density. And when they mean texel density, it's basically just like how many pixels can be applied to a single unit inside of the software. So you're thinking about how many pixels can be packed to the model, right? How many pixels do you need to define to it? Texel density, you know, comes in play when you're dealing with a large production with multiple people, and you want to make certain that, you know, the smallest object in the environment has the same amount of pixel detail for the textures as, say, the largest object, right? You want to keep that consistency so that you're not seeing a lot of like really fine detail packed down onto the desk or the table or the book on the table, but much less being packed onto the walls, for example, right? Where you can see very distinct differences in the pixel information. It's a bit of an inconsistency that people will pick up for, especially in real-time work in games, because you can get your camera so close, but it can show up as well in film and VFX. So a couple things that I try to do, because we can't set texel density at this time inside of 3ds Max. What I try to do is I'll do some comparative measurements, get it pretty close. And one thing that can really help out with this is doing a quick packing algorithm on Max. So inside the Edit UV window, you'll find, and we'll show this to you, there's a packing tool that can help, you know, unify all the objects together and make them relative to their physical size and scale in the real world as the UV coordinates. And this will really help out with regards to making certain that all your UVs are the same relative size, and so they're using the same relative amount of pixels or texel density for the maps. But sometimes you might also find that you need to make things smaller or larger. So if you were building, say, a statue and you had to have the base of the statue or the underside of it, the bottom piece, you might want to make that smaller. Or if you were working on a character model, sometimes what artists will do, especially for games, is they'll make the the head, either a much larger set of UV coordinates, or so they'll scale them up or they'll put them on their own UV map, because the head, the face of a character, when you think about it in the real world, it's something that we stare at a lot ourselves. And as such, it's very important to put the importance or overscale the UVs sometimes where importance is going to be looked at. And so this gets back to that first point I was talking about initially in regards to this idea that we want to think about how and where our objects are being looked at and used, and try to make very important areas a little bit larger, a little bit more dominant, so they have more pixel information to be applied to it, and less important areas possibly a little bit smaller, especially if there's something that faces the ground or you're never really going to see as part of the camera. They might not need to be as important or as physically large in the UV space to make it work. From there, once I got everything lined up, I'm liking the size, the scale, I'm distortion free, all my faces have been mapped up. One thing I'll try to do here is I'll try to stitch my UVs together. I find that, when I work with, as an artist and I'm making my textures, or if I'm working with other texture artists or people on a team, what they really don't want to have is they don't want to have that mess of flattened UV coordinates spread out everywhere, right? A lot of times artists, especially when they were working in 2D applications and having to hand paint all of the texture information on there, you want to have a nice, clean, uniform set of UV coordinates that understand. So what I mean by that is you want to be able to look at the UV coordinates that have been provided and be able to mentally map them back to locations on the mesh. So they should make sense. And a lot of the ways that you can do this, or one of the ways that you can do this that makes a lot of sense, is using this stitching function that exists inside of 3ds Max. And you're basically just kind of looking for common or shared edges, and you're trying to reattach UVs together so that they make much more logical chunks that a person can understand. Or in some cases, if you needed to have, say, like on the side of this little cargo crate here, there's these scratches, these grooves that are kind of carrying across. I wanted them lined up with UV coordinates so that it made it much easier for me as an artist to just manually kind of paint in that scratching that was there and make it continue from one side of the surface to the next side of the surface. And really, if you can do this, the cool part is you're going to make a friend out of your texture artist, or you're going to, have a much more enjoyable experience when you're doing that texture. If you kind of fail to do this, I find sometimes you kind of get like the evil glares and stares from your fellow coworkers in the scene, because they're the one that's stuck working with your art, and so it can be a little bit difficult. So one of the recommendations I would like to put out there right now for those of you, especially if you're working in maybe a smaller environment, like a small studio where you're on your own as an indie, maybe think about finding a partner, so someone online that you can trust, and send them your UV coordinates and ask them to texture it really fast and see how it goes. The texturing aspect of it all, even if it's something really quick, one of the tutorials I did when I was teaching people how to do UVs is we would just take a sphere and we would try to make various types of like balls out of it. So ball textures for it. So like a beach ball, a toy ball, a ball with a star on it, things like that. And I would have each of my students go and actually, they would spend about 5 or 10 minutes just trying to unwrap it based on what they saw or what they knew the output was going to be for the texture or the reference. And then when they had finished unwrapping it, they would pass it to the person on the left of them. And they would then have that person go and texture their model. So everybody would kind of be working on everyone else's files and then sharing and discussing, what worked really well and what didn't work well. So that this really helped kind of give a lot of constructive feedback towards thinking about how are other people going to work with my files and my art and be something that's constructive and I can get a result out of it. And of course, once all that's done, we're going to want to repack the data, because likely when we've been stitching all the UVs, we'll go from a nicely packed area, then they'll start overlapping each other again. So we're going to want to pack the data. This is typically done in what's called the 0011 space. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into Max, so it makes a little bit more sense. But this is the primary UDIM space that you see being used. Anything beyond there, there's different squares and grid patterns that happen. These are different UDIM spaces. So getting back to that original UDIM question from the very beginning, UDIMs are basically just different spaces. So 0011 is what we typically see and we work with. And there's other spaces from there. So you'd have like a 0012, 0013, 1011. There's all these different ways, and it's just like mapping coordinates for software or for the GPU to know how to understand what goes where and how it gets arranged. Most of the packing algorithms can do a pretty good job of figuring out what's going to best fit in here. What you're really aiming for when you're using one of these packing algorithms is you want to have the minimal amount of wasted or dead or empty pixel space going on. You know, if you're working with an organic shape, you know, you probably want less than 40% of empty space being used. The smaller you can get this, of course, the better it's going to be. Sometimes it's just hard to get something like that. With hard surface shapes, it's much easier to pack in because you're usually dealing with stuff that's more square and can fit more tightly together. And the reason why this is really important is that dead pixels are still pixels that are loaded into memory by your software, and that's wasted memory. So especially when you're talking about real-time applications, stuff for mobile, VR, anything like that that's using real-time, and you've got a finite amount of GPU RAM that you have to work with. Every pixel that you use, it doesn't matter, or you load in, it doesn't matter if it's being used by the model, is used up memory by the software application that's trying to run it and process it. So being efficient with your texture space, which means being efficient with your packing, can really lead to significant benefits on your software and your output times and how performant things are, because especially when you're dealing with real time, the moment you run out of VRAM on your hardware, that means your computer has to start swapping between the GPU and to your hard drive, and you'll see a significant drop in performance at that point because the computer is actively trying to swap data in and out of memory. Some extra considerations that I try to put in when I'm packing UVs, because packing algorithms will just look at it and say, I'm just going to fit it in with what works best. And that can sometimes be great. But sometimes it might be important to think about how you're going to group your UV coordinates together. So you might need to manually do a little bit of packing as well. So thinking about things that have the same color or texture could be really important. So what I mean by that is often, especially in something like this, you see that there's a little bit of gap space between each of these UV islands that are going on here. This gap space is really important because as the object gets further away from your object in the camera view, especially in a real-time system, what's going to happen is that it's also going to load up a smaller or lower resolution bitmap, so a MIP map that you see being used. When it loads up these MIP maps, it's basically going to take the bitmap information and it's going to do just like Photoshop does when it scales it down to a next lower 2 to the power of value. And what happens sometimes is that your pixels will start to blend and blur and get muddied together. And so having your objects with a similar color or color information grouped together can actually help produce better results because you don't have to worry about this map bleed that can happen and take place here. You're also going to want to maybe like think about just logical places where you could fit UVs, but the software doesn't think you can do it. Sometimes this might be in the gap of another object or a curve, things like that. So you want to consider things like that. You also want to consider if you should be overlap or sharing space. Not a lot of the packing algorithms out there do a very good job if you actually are using overlap or sharing space. And so this is really important to keep in consideration. So if you have a vehicle with say 6 tires on it, you don't want to have probably all 6 tires with their own explicit unique mapping for each of the tires. You're going to share those UV coordinates between each of the tire pieces. So you're going to want to keep those overlapped. And that's something that some of the packing algorithms just don't take into consideration and work with at this time. And of course, from there, after that, you're going to want to export. Export to your favorite painting application. Use it inside of Max. Use our baking to texture tool that we introduced to 2021, and use that to project high resolution data down to low res. Use it to project OSL data down to a bitmap. Whatever you want to be doing with it inside of Max. Or you can take it to another third-party painting application and work with it there. Really, at this point, you've got usable, workable UV coordinates. You want to get it out there and start playing with it and applying it and seeing what you get. So those are my 6 steps. Are there any kind of questions that popped up from there, Bruno?
I think we're good so far. There was a question about if it was possible to kind of estimate or get like an accurate get the accurate information about the empty space or the empty UV that you have on a specific object. Is it just like you guess by the look of the the packing that you have, or can you actually get like a specific kind of ratio?
In the old days, and I'll talk like old days when I say for me like 2004, we used to have to go to like the image application and kind of use a selection method. Sometimes you use like a black background and you look for like, how many of my pixels are black, and use the approximation from there. I've seen some more modern tools and some stuff like that. They do give an information or a report on how dense the packing is, or their estimation on the packing. Even with those, it seems about 70–80% is kind of like an efficient packing amount that you're seeing with really aggressive packing algorithms that are trying to like just really push things together. And of course, with somewhat higher resolution maps, you can pack things a little closer because you've got your visual gap space between, you know, what it bounds to. Like, you want to try to have like roughly about 6 pixels of space between each of the UV shells and islands. It works much better for slightly higher resolution, say like a 10K or 2K or 4K bitmap, as opposed to say something under 1K where there's going to be more bleeding that can go on. Yep. Do we have some rules for when you do and do not overlap UVs for parts of an object that are the same? For instance, if you're baking AO. This is a tricky one. So I find if the object's similar to each other, I'll try to overlap the items in the objects. If you're trying to use, say, the idea of a trim sheet and building ambient occlusion out of it, I would maybe actually try to just, when you build a trim sheet, usually in Max or another application, what you basically have is a plane, and then you get your 3D model data that you're trying to build on top of it, right? So you might have your pipes, your screw bolts, your panels, your plating, your rivets, your tread plates, whatever you think you're going to use for this kind of texture. And often when you see people doing trim sheets for more modern experiences, they'll actually build the AO based on the trim sheet data that's on there, as opposed to trying to use the mesh, the 3D mesh data off of it and to work with that. So if you can work with that way, where you've got the AO built into the trim sheet, that works great. If you are, in my opinion, in my experience, if you're building it on the model itself, and you kind of have to just go with the coordinates that are there, because you have to use explicit coordinates, and you're trying to share UVs and things like that, you're going to want to sort of more actively think about the UV coordinates and how you're going to arrange things. So common objects and shapes are going to work there, because what can happen is when you stack and overlap objects on top of each other, what ends up happening is that the rendering system, for when it bakes the bitmaps out, will use whatever the topmost set of faces are on top of there. So it's kind of like, it's not necessarily Z fighting, it's just sort of like order of operations. So last in, first in, last out, kind of, so a philo kind of idea. So whichever one was kind of put last has precedence on the baking information that gets baked down onto the UVs for the coordinates. So you want to kind of actively think about how, when you've got UVs stacked together, how the order is going to be, and whether or not one might cause fighting or lighting information distortions over top of the other ones. Unfortunately, there's not much of a better way for that one.
I guess it kind of depends, like the intended usage of the object as well. Because if your goal is to go into a game engine and you want to do some light baking, I mean, every single phase need to have their own UV space, right?
Yeah, yeah. And when you look at like light baking, especially stuff that's built into a lot of the game engines now, the light baking literally does the quick and dirty flatten mapping method usually that you see. So that very first example where it just kind of, all it's really doing is it's looking at the maps. It's got a threshold of like how much edge angle difference is there between each face. If it's more than, say, 30 degrees or 20 degrees, it's going to map that out, create a seam, map it out to its own flattened map. So when you look at these light maps, typically they're generated from like a game engine or an automatic method. Usually they're just sort of this like scattered mess where you can't really make much sense of like what face maps up where. Sean, do you have any other thoughts on the topic about overlapping for AO?
Not necessarily. I mean, I guess one thing to point out is that you are allowed to have multiple channels, and depending on what you're mapping things out to, right? So you don't have to bake everything into one channel.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to kill the PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to get everyone into what they want to see, which is the 3ds Max part of it. hopefully, has everyone seen Max showing up here? This will be more of a question to our panelists that are with the ability to speak as opposed to everyone else. Okay, so a couple comments.
Fine.
It looks like it's good. Okay, people are seeing this. And so at this point, if you guys have any questions, throw them up in the chat. I'll try to do a live demo of UVing. And while that's going on, Bruno and Sean will be, I guess, looking at the questions and we'll try to answer them together verbally. I think Bruno and Sean, if you guys want to turn your cameras on, I think you can at this time. And we'll go from there, and we'll leave this as kind of an interactive method of, hey, let's go texture something. I'll talk about my process as I'm working away, and then Bruno and Sean will be helping ask questions, answer insights, and we'll go from there, make it nice and interactive. Okay,
let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So I'm just going to hide my Zoom panel again, so it's out of the way. Okay, so I'm using here Max 2021.0, so nothing new or fancy. Sorry, guys, you're not really going to get any sneak peeks on anything that's really work in progress on here. And the model I've got loaded up here, this is the sci-fi helmet that I've got. I think I use this as part of the 2021.0 release video webinar. So I thought I'd just reuse it again. It's also the same video I used when I did this presentation to the Max team about UVs. So a couple things I'm going to do right away that I like to do is I'm just going to make this command panel double wide. Double wide command panel, it just adds more access to a lot of the tools and features you're going to need. So that's going to go from there. I'm going to take a quick peek at this model. I'm just going to make certain that the edge loops look clean and I can kind of understand the shape and the form on it. One thing that's kind of really important to look at is things that might be like hard edges or hard surfaces on here. That might be important to think about using or working with. So there's a few on here. And then we're just going to go and add the unwrap UVW modifier. By Z, there we go. And then I'm just going to hit F4 to turn on edge faces overlay so I can see all my edges that are going on. So one of the most basic ways that people can start doing UVs right away here is you can just do normal clicking. So you can just do some click selections here. I believe by default the unwrap has backface override turned on, so I can actually just kind of do some marquee selections. And so for example, I can do a quick little marquee selection right here, just grabbing some faces, right? This is the most simple way. Back when I was learning this in 2004, this is quite literally what I was trying to do. Looks like I grabbed a few back here. So what we were doing, we were just kind of grabbing faces and we're saying, okay, this looks kind of flat or plainish. Let's go turn it into a selection. So I've got the selection going on here, nice and quick and simple. As you can see here, the unwrap UVW modifier's got a whole bunch of different tools and options in here. For a lot of these, I don't necessarily need to worry about them too much. So one of the ways I'm going to do, what I'm going to do really quick here, is I'm just going to use this little option right here called Quick Planar Map. And I'm going to click on it. And as you see right away, what ended up happening is I've got this green line that's shown up out here. The green line dictates where a border or a boundary is for a UV island or set of coordinates that are there. And if I click on this Open UV Editor here, I'm going to get this Edit UV window that's going to pop up. And we're going to see two things. So we're going to see my current selection shown on the screen here. And it's got this freeform transform gizmo shown here. So I'm just going to move my UVs out of the way. Looks like I grabbed a few extra pieces by accident. And then we can also see that there's this mess right here, right? This is kind of like overlapping cluster of faces here. This overlapping cluster of faces, these are UV coordinates. So technically you could, you've got UVs, congratulations. They're great, but they are also a huge problem because they are not going to show right. So if I go here, I'm just going to go back to default shading. So I've got the checker pattern showing up here. And you can see from my coordinates that I mapped up, I've got some nice, clean, squarish looking grid lines coming here. The text isn't distorted at all. It's looking pretty good. But if we look at the pre-generated UV coordinates that were already here from the modeling, it looks okay from maybe at this angle, right? Because it's all forward facing. But as we start looking around at the side, we can start seeing a lot of distortions going on where our grid pattern is a mess. We can see where the lettering becomes a bit of a problem. There's even this like kind of double overlap where the 8 gets repeated there. So this is where, a great example of just visualizing distortions going on in your scene right away with the checker pattern can kind of come into play.
So there's a question, Logan, about how do you pass the selection from the modifier stack to the UV modifier tool, like the edit UV?
So the edit UV modifier, the unwrap UV modifier right now doesn't, at this time, it doesn't let you pass the selection set going up. I believe there's a few ways with the DCM to do this, but I'm going to try to keep this a little less uber technical with regards to steps and processes, and just kind of keep us focused on the unwrap UVW modifier.
All right.
I hope you guys don't mind that answer. Okay, so we've got this idea here. This is the simplest way. Like I said, we can have make some selections and we can start planar mapping, and that can work out. I mean, it's a slow process, but it's something you can do, but it's not necessarily a lot of fun. What I'm going to do here in this edit window is I'm going to just take these pre-generated coordinates. I'm going to shove them off to the side because I don't care about them. And I'm just going to focus on this here. So I've got this pre-generated set of coordinates. I can double click to make an element selection. And I'm just going to put them back where we were. So like I said, I got this going on here. The distortion doesn't seem too bad, but this is probably a good example where we can maybe see what the peel output is going to give us. So I'm just going to click on quick peel. Quick peel works after you've had it'll work on your continuous or contiguous UV island set. So let's see if there's any changes. We're going to see it right away if there is. So it doesn't look like there's too much that went on. So all the peel option's doing here is it's just looking at the algorithm, and it's looking at the average of all the faces, and it's trying to figure out like how can I like flatten, distort, stretch, move, modify these. Most times the peel method will work pretty good for you here. If not, there are a couple other methods. There's relax up here that can also help you out, but we're not going to focus on that at this point in time. So what I typically do, I've got this coordinate good. I've peeled it. It's got distortions free, or mostly distortion free. So it's looking fairly good. I'm just going to shove it off to the side here, and I'm going to worry about my next set of faces. And so like I said, I can sit here and I can manually kind of go and start clicking. Clicking slow, painful, boring, not a lot of fun. So what I might end up trying to do instead is one of the things I really like that we've got in Max here is this ability to apply seams. So the seams is found right over here under the seam section under peel. And what's really nice about seams is that I can do a couple things with it, right? So I'm just going to go to edge mode. One thing I can do right away is I can click on this edit seams button, and basically any edge that I click on, it doesn't matter if I can also be in polygon mode. I can use edit seams to click edges. But what's going on is you can see as I click on a seam here, on an edge, it's making these blues. So these are highlighting it as a seam. Seams become really important when you, for peel mapping, because they will influence where faces can be connected and where they shouldn't be connected. But they also come in handy because they can also be used to help augment selections that are going on here. And so one of the ways is you can go around and click on each piece. Sorry, Sean, you had a question? Yeah,
someone's asking here, since you're talking about that, they want to know the difference between a quick peel and relax and which one is better to use, et cetera.
Okay, cool. So a quick peel, all the quick peel is doing, so if I have my face selection here, so the quick planar map, sorry, quick planar map or quick peel?
Quick peel.
Quick peel, okay, sorry. Quick peel, so we got quick peel, we've got peel mode, and reset peel. So it should be almost the same here, quick peel, peel mode, reset peel. So what's gonna go on here is that these are the same buttons between here and here. So with quick peel, with this isolated island right here, if I click quick peel, all it's really doing is it's moving the UV coordinates to the center. It's kind of trying to normalize them. So normalizing meaning that it's trying to set it to the 0, 0, 1, 1 space. So this thick border that you see here displayed. And it's trying to average it out, right? If I do this on this ugly continuous model here and I try to peel it out, all I got was this kind of distorted mess because it doesn't know how to flatten the shape up because there's no breaks or distortions going on in it, right? It's just what it is. If we look at things like peel mode, what peel mode is going to do is it's going to put us into more of an interactive mode. I don't normally work with peel mode on, but what you could do with it, so it's active, you can actually start using the seams, and there's also another tool. I'll get into this maybe a little more detail in a bit, but you can use it to define the breaks. And as you start breaking up and applying seams, the model should be updating and moving itself with each kind of change or update that you're doing to it. So I'll maybe get into that in a little bit more when I've got this big gross shape broken down a bit. And then the last option here, reset peel, is it basically just resets everything.
Hey Sean, Logan, there's a suggestion to turn off the checker in the UV editor, the background. Might be easier to see the island.
On my drop down.
Yeah.
Well, that's to display on the actual
These
mesh.
are the display
thing.
options up here, yeah. So
It's
is that better
different.
for everybody?
Yeah.
With some contrast? Yeah, we'll go with that. Okay. So what we had going before was the checker pattern default. And then this is the textured checker, which is the color display that's going on here. Okay, so there's probably much rejoicing now that people can see a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to get back to what I was doing here. So like I said, we got the seam tools. We can use these to kind of click on edges. It doesn't matter which component mode you're in, vertex, face, or edge, but you can click on them and add them. And so you can click to add it. And if you got one in a bad spot, of course, just like anything else in Max, if you hold on Alt and click on it, it's going to take away from the selection. This is okay, but it's kind of slow. So we've also got this really cool point-to-point tool. What the point-to-point tool is going to do, so you see as I've hovered over this edge here, it's highlighted it. And what it's doing is as I'm moving around, it's trying to find the shortest possible path to get around the mesh. So as you see, as I start moving it, we're starting to see different objects highlighting here. So as I start clicking on this, you can see that I'm adding these blue lines to my mesh, right? And this is creating seams. And the seams are incredibly beneficial because, I'm just gonna right click to end this operation here. What I can do, I've got the seam now, I've gone around this kind of top piece portion right here. And I've created this seam. And now what I can do is I've go to face mode, I can just select on this one face, and there's this little button right here, expand polygon selection to seams. And it's going to basically expand it until it hits a seam edge. So if I didn't do a total seaming, so if I didn't lock the seam off so it wouldn't go anywhere, it would select the entire mesh. But this is really good because I've got this selection going here. And I can just quickly turn this once again over to a quick planar map. And I see that I've got this output to it. And the output's okay. There's a little bit of distortion going on. So a couple things that I can do here. I could go into the interactive mode, but what I might just do here is kind of show another method that I could do as well. So I could also like go in and manually define seams on these parts here. But what I can also do is actually just go into the edit window here.
Hey, Logan.
Yep.
They're talking here, and they're actually, what they want to do is remove the image altogether, which you can turn off at the top of your UV window. Go to the left, go to the right. It's one of the icons. It's the 7th icon from the left. It's up. Yeah.
That one?
Yeah, I think that's what they're asking for.
Perfect. Okay. We'll do that then. Okay. So I made the selection here in my UV window here, Edit UV. So you can see that the selection maps back out into the viewport here. So it's a nice one-to-one comparison and to see what's going on here. And one thing I can do here as well is I can choose this option called break. And when I hit break, you see that the UVs for the edges here go from white showing that they're combined or joined. So you've got a shared face between the two edges, and now they're broken. So we've got an edge per face here. And what this can happen though, and the benefit it can provide is as I break it, make proper selections that is, and I take my selection once again, and if I go and I quick peel it, you'll see it gave me a different result. So seams and breaking UVs will actually help you with this. And this is kind of the same thing you can do when you've got it set into peel mode. I don't normally work in peel mode, but we'll turn it on for the sake of showing it. So as we work with it, we can actually keep on going and creating seams for it. That's what usually goes on here. So I've created a seam right there. That's great. That's what I want to have happen. Now let's go add one here and here. And there's another break. So we're making selections, we're breaking the UVs, and as you can see, it's updating and trying to rearrange everything going along. And we're getting minimal distortions with our mesh, right? So if I drop out of peel mode, I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger so we can see it visually and see how the mapping's going on it. Just by adding some breaks and some peels, it actually makes it really easy to start to minimize the distortion that's going on in the mesh and work it out. So what you can do here sometimes is, how I will sometimes work with this is I'll either use my selections either out of the edit window here, or I'll do them inside of Max, and I'll just start trying to think about areas that maybe are the easiest to break apart. So I've got this big mess for the helmet. I'm not quite certain how I'm going to break it apart there, but what I might do is I might look at breaking this back piece off really fast. And another way I can do this is I can go to edge mode. I can just double click on an edge. It's going to select the entire edge loop for us. And then there's one last really kind of cool function under the seams area, which is convert edge selection to seams. So I can do that. It's made that conversion selection to it. Face, expand, do planar map. So we can see we got our plane here. It's a little bit distorted because the shape has got a bit of a curve to it. So the peel should probably help impact this a bit more. And that should help us out. So we got a better output to it. And it's just gonna be a matter of just kind of working along and around your mesh and making things work. Maybe one thing I've realized right away though is that, oh crap, I need this selection right here added to it. So I'm just gonna kind of quickly go in, add this to my selection. Got it here. Let me move these two actually. I'm gonna quick planar map this, and I'm gonna peel it so it's as distortion free possible. And now I want to figure out a way that I can go and attach this piece to here, because in my mind, this is the same kind of like, maybe it's like a black plastic kind of piece, kind of a foldy part of it all, right? But one thing that's going wrong here is that these are two different sizes. So I can manually try to scale them, or this might be an option where using one of the packing systems inside of Max can work really well. So if I've got these two pieces selected here, and I just scroll down in the Edit UV window here, I can actually just maybe do a quick pack. And this is gonna basically size the objects together to the same relative size that's going on here. So they're packed together a little bit better, and so they have the same relative size. And now if I go to edge mode, I'm just gonna look at finding the common edge that they share, which looks like it's this piece here. And then I'm gonna use the stitching tools. And so inside of Max, there's a bunch of stitching tools. Probably the one that works best is this custom stitch. What it's gonna do is it's going to find the matching faces that align and share this edge. It's gonna move them and it's gonna weld them all together. So what I'm gonna get out of it is this kind of output right here. And so this is great because I now have this ability to not only use Max in the UV window to make selections, but I can also use them to fix and rejoin things together. So sometimes you might find it's easier to select your pieces inside the viewport in Max, and other times you might just actually have pieces that work out better for selection inside of the Edit UV window to make the selection and remap them that way.
So there's a question about the best use of straight-in selection under reshape elements. Would that be something that you could have used for this, or?
The straighten selection, where is that again?
It's under reshape element.
Yeah, so straighten selection, no, it doesn't work that way. So the algorithm and how it works in Max, if I was to use it on here, what it's gonna try to do is it will try to straighten what it can, but if the piece isn't just capable of it, you kind of get this distortion out of it. How it can sometimes work, or how you typically maybe see it working, is it will try to make it into a square grid, as opposed to it'll try to like straighten out these pieces as well, so make it more horizontal, vertical grid like. It sometimes works. It might work well if it maybe had like a cylindrical piece with say some rippling kind of to it that you wanted to straighten out and make it so it didn't have any distortions to it. But in my experience, it normally doesn't work too well with say an organic piece that's got more movement going on with it.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
So there's a question about what's the difference between the pink seam and the green one?
The pink seam and the green one. So the green seam, so by seam, I'm assuming, so the very seams that we see here. So the white one basically means that this edge is shared between two polygons. So it's got a shared edge to it. The green ones basically are denoting where there's not a shared edge, or where there is a border basically going on, right? So it's an unshared UV edge that's happening. So the vertices here in the UV space are split different than they are in the world space, right? And then the pink seams, which are, I forget where to get the pink seams up. There's another set, and there's the blue seams that we see as well sometimes. So
I think it was in the viewport that we see
the viewport. Oh, there was the, I mean, they probably mean these ones, right? We're in these pink ones here. These pink ones just denote that they are, that we're in the peel mode.
Okay.
That's all that's going on. Yeah.
Thanks, Logan.
Yeah. And there's also blue seams. You probably don't see them. Oh, yeah, you see them right now, actually. So the blue seams are basically literally denoting that they're a seam that's been defined by the user.
Okay.
Okay. But they are overridden. So if you have a map seam that's at the same spot as a peel seam, then the map seam will override it and go from there.
So there is another question that I'm assuming you're going to get to that, so I'm just preparing. Someone wants to know, how do you calculate the padding for your UV clusters when you go to?
Sure. I will try to be mindful of time. So I guess Bruno and Sean, let me know if we're going over too far. But as long as everyone's enjoying things and no one's screaming, "Let me out of here," we're going to keep on. I'll just keep on trying to map and model stuff. So normally the padding is handled down here in the range elements section. This is where the packing is handled. The padding is it's mathematically set. So when you think about your UV space, so like I said, this square denotes the 0011 space. If you have a bitmap applied to it, this is your top leftmost pixel, this is your bottom rightmost pixel. The UV spaces don't necessarily, they do and they don't equate to textures. So what happens is in the software and in your real-time application and everything like that, what will happen is your bitmap will be loaded and it will be applied to fit from the 00 to 11 space. Regardless of the pixel size. So it doesn't matter if you're 32 by 32 or your 4K image, it's going to map itself to this space that's going on here for this space, or essentially what you can consider as a UDIM. This is what Bruno was it, UDIM 0, UDIM 1, one of the two. So your texture is going to map in here. Your UV mapping coordinates do not equate to pixel properties, right? And so this is where this padding value comes into play, because it's a bit of a math thing that's going on where you need to figure out exactly the amount of padding for your spaces that are going in here. Typically, I find the padding defaults for Macs are kind of set more for sub 1K bitmap sizes, which are still, there's still a lot of use for those things. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll just manually try to like decrease these a bit, and so you'll see if I have the selection and I'm going to just pack these together. Having a size 0, 1, there's a bit of gap here. If I have this as, say, a bigger size, just to kind of show more of an example, and I make the selection again and I pack them, you can see there's more space going on here. So this is what the padding's trying to do. The padding store are trying to say, how much space do I want to try to leave between all of the UV islands? And this is what you would use to calculate, the gap that's going on here.
I think that the person might want to know, how do you make the choice of how much space you want to leave between them?
Yeah, and that's a tough one, especially because you're kind of using numerical values here. I think the rule of thumb back, when I do textures is you want to try to leave the equivalency of about 6 pixels of space. Of course, the problem is that this space doesn't equate itself to numerical values for like pixel values. So you're kind of trying to use, you're eyeballing up numerical values in here. So it's unfortunately one of those things you just sort of have to try out and know for what's going on.
I guess it depends of your texture size at the end, and all of this will kind of influence if you have bleeding at some point.
Yep.
So there's another good question here. If I unwrap a certain area and I'm not happy with the seam, is there a way to reset only that area without resetting the entire UVW, or is stitching my only option?
Yeah, this is usually why I don't use the peel mode, because the peel mode kind of assumes you want to peel mode the entire mesh. And so this is usually why I'll just do it on a specific object. So like, let's take this piece here, just turn that off. If, for example, I only wanted, there's a bit of a gap going on in here. If I wanted those pieces separated out, what I might do is, like just, breaking it here. So I might add a seam, or I could just break it naturally inside of Max. And then I'm going to go over to polygons, make a selection. So I find just using peel mode for the quick peel, and then just either defining seams or making selections and either remapping them really fast and peeling them again probably works a little bit faster, quicker than say trying to sit there and fight with the UVs and the coordinates and how they're going to work, right?
So there's actually another question, and I don't remember when he was talking about, but he asked, to preserve chamfer corner details when baking hard surfaces, high poly details to low poly geometries, is it better to create seam on the corner like you did before, so you must have been referring to something, or is it better to approach differently?
So we're talking about, all right, let's create a little cube in the scene here. So I think what the guy is talking about here is, so assume you have a box, and then you might have you know, some chamfer detail on here, right? So let's throw the chamfer modifier on. And maybe you've got something like this going on, right? And I'm going to duplicate this box really fast just so you can see what's going on here. So you've got the original box that you've got, and then you've also got this lower red, or this chamfered version of the box. Typically what you'll find when you do, or at least what I found when I've done UVs in the kind of case like this, sorry, I'll just go play mode really fast so we can see a little easier, is you're inevitably, like, you can take a box like this and you can unwrap it really quickly. So by default, your box has a shape like that. I'm just gonna make a selection of all the pieces. And I'm gonna just do an unfold mapping. Let's walk to closest face. This is one of those automatic algorithms. So just mapping, unfold, walk to closest face. Works really good on low poly objects. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to like trace along and figure out the best way to, or a way to map it out. So what you'll find even on a cube is that it's gonna be inevitable that you're gonna have seams going on in certain locations here, right? Looks like the unfold didn't weld really quickly. There we go. You're gonna have seams that happen on it, right? So only a couple of them are gonna be shared edges. So this can sometimes be a problem when you're trying to deal with chamfers because the coordinates won't necessarily try to map itself in, right? So when you think about a normal map, the rays are shooting based on the angle of the faces. And when you've got a curved surface, you maybe don't have enough detail in it to actually capture the curvature that you want to have from your chamfer, right? So this might be a situation where you actually maybe want to throw smaller chamfer on here. So this is where like the 0 segment chamfer can come and play because the surface normals will point out, the face normals will point out, and they can catch this curvature data that we see here. So if this had even more curvature on it, there's more rounding going on. Sometimes you might just need more detail to capture because what can happen with your UVs is that your edges like this, I find when, especially when you bake out a normal map, these hard edges here, they can sometimes cause creases to occur just because there's not enough mesh detail for it to figure out exactly how to map and how to align, or there could also sometimes be like some distortions that go on. So by having the chamfer on there, even a 0 segment chamfer, this just adds just a little bit more mesh information and surface normals that are pointing in the direction that match the curvature of your shape. And this can help capture because what works really well is that with the chamfer modifier max, they're non-destructive UVs. So what it's actually trying to do is, even though I had the UVs generated below the chamfer, when it generated the chamfer, it's going to use the mapping coordinates that were created before that existed on the model, and it's going to use those to build new mapping coordinates out of it. And these are going to be really good because then if you did like a bake to texture or some sort of projection baking method, you're going to have the UV coordinates that are going to point in the necessary direction to kind of grab that information and pull it down, and it's going to work really well from there. And then the last thing you might want to do to augment this as well, so if we look at the shapes without any wireframe overlay on top of them, we can see that the box with the chamfer has a little bit of a hard edges to it. And this is also where, say, weighted normals can come and play. So I just threw the weighted normals modifier in here, and we can see already what it's done is it's adjusted the surface normals, so the vertex normals, so that instead of pointing specifically in one direction, they now have a bit more of a fanning going on. And they've been told also to average and smooth out the results. So this ensures that there are no hard edges being here. The hard edges can, of course, cause problems with you doing a bake to texture and then capturing the data that you want to have. But also now that there's more normals that are going on in your shape, it also has more of an ability for it to raycast, to project, and catch what you want it to catch. I hope that answers the question there. There's a comment on here. Anyone else find peel mode a little frustrating? Yes, unfortunately, I do find it frustrating myself. Something I'm hoping that we can look at some point soon, but there's no ETA on when we would be able to look at that just yet. But I agree, it should be a little more user friendly.
And just back to the chamfering, that destroying the UV, that's new, no? Was that something that we pushed in 2021 or?
It came out in 2021 or 2020.3. I can't remember which one exactly. But this is a big time saver,
Yeah.
especially as an artist. If you're working on game stuff, there is nothing worse than you've got your model, it's looking great, you've gotten almost all your approval you needed from your head, your lead, and then someone says, "Hey, can you
Last chamfer
chamfer those edges there?" And you're just like, "Oh, you have no idea how difficult that chamfer that you just asked me to do would be," right? So this ability to have the chamfer, and this chamfer ability for the UV preservation works for both the chamfer modifier, but also for the edit poly modifier and the editable poly class object. So it's going to work the same for all three sets, which is really cool. And I mean, it's not like a feature that you can be like, "Oh my God, look at UV beef preserves and it's awesome." But it's something that I'm sure every artist out there is probably going to be like, "Oh my God, this is fantastic to have." I cannot tell you how frustrating it was not.
There's another question about rotating islands.
Sure.
How to align rotated island to a fixed vertical orientation? Say, for example, an angle of 10 degrees or.
Okay, so a couple things I try to do if I got to rotate it here. So say I've got this piece here, if I want this perfectly straight, a couple things I might try to do is, so I'm gonna double click on it and I'm gonna use the freeform mode here. I might try to eyeball it a little bit. The catch is that, of course, the UVs have generated as they generated and they've relaxed as they needed to relax. So they might not always be perfectly straight. If you needed to, there are some alignment tools here. So if I go to just like these edges here, there is a vertical edge alignment. Oops, there's a vertical edge alignment somewhere in here. That's not what I wanted. And this might give you a North Star or kind of a point to work at it. Now the problem that you're probably facing is that you've got this, and if you're using the freeform tool, you would go on the cardinal points to rotate it. And as you can see, as I'm rotating it, it's rotating, but you can see I got these weird angle orientations on here. So I'm trying to get to 10 degrees. It's kind of a frustrating experience to get to because it's letting me freely rotate it. And this same kind of thing occurs as well if I was just using the rotation tool, right? It's giving me the same output on it. So what you can actually do inside of Max is if you turn on your angle snaps will, of course, when you're rotating normally, it will actually snap you. So mine are set to 5-degree increments, so this works out really well. And that if I wanted to rotate at 10 degrees, I could just do this. You can see I've got 10-degree rotation on it. And that works out really well. If you guys aren't certain how to set your angle snaps, if you actually just right-click over any of the snapping tools at the top, you can actually change the options right here. And so say if I wanted at, say, 0.5, which is another popular one, I can do that. And then I can just keep on rotating, and it's going to basically snap to various angles, whatever increments, radial degree or degree increment I've given it. So that's all of that question. So far, so good.
Here's a pretty big question dealing with real world scale. While working for a company requiring products textured, they want the texture to be in real world scale, and they haven't found a fix to create a box of 10 inches and apply a 10-inch texture and try to make the UV of the main product match the reference box. Is there a better way to do this? Basically, the question, I think, is how do you work with real world scale in the UV editor?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's not one I've worked with too much. I might defer if Bruno or Sean, if you guys have done any experience with it.
I don't really use the unwrap editor. I usually try to use with primitives that just natively handle real world scale, honestly.
Yeah, that would be the unwrap. I guess one way you could do it, maybe, so in the UVW map modifier, there's ability to use real world map size on here. You could turn this on, right? Use your real world map size. God, where did that button go? There it is. So it's turned on and set, and you can see it's scaling like mad. But with the real world map size set, you could then go into your unwrap if you needed to custom unwrap it to minimize distortions. You can go in here, and all you're seeing really is the difference is that the UVs are just really big in comparison, right? So this might be one way to kind of quickly work with it, is that you could use the UV map modifier to quickly apply a real world scale on there. You've got at least a basis to start with, and then you can kind of map from there. Keeping in mind though, when you're using real world scale, it's almost like we're using trim sheets. So what ends up happening is that even though our UVs are way outside of this 0011 space that's going on here, all that's happening is that the bitmap is just basically told to tile and repeat itself and keep on continuously going. And this is fine. The only problem that you might find is if you were trying to use like a bake to texture operation. So like if you wanted to map your ambient occlusion, or you had some normal map detail that you wanted to map to specific faces, you can only map out one UDIM at a time. So all you would map out is this square here, which is only occupied by this one single face, right? So what you might end up having to do is inside of Max, there's the ability to have multiple map channels. So you see here, typically if like you're doing real-time work, you're going to be working on map channel 1. But if you're doing like some sort of production work for something that wasn't games, some games can handle multiple map channels as well. But if you're doing work for like anything that's like offline rendering or VFX or film and things like that, you can use multiple map channels to map different data out. So what you might end up doing is going with a map channel 2. It's going to give you this little warning about, hey, what do you want to do here? So I'm just going to move my data over or copy it over. And you might end up having to like explicitly map your coordinates from there, right? So I might just, for the sake of sheer laziness and showing off, one of the problems that might happen if you were to use an automatic algorithm, so like a flatten mapping. So I can flatten map. I'm going to choose maybe a 25-degree angle here instead of 45. And I hit OK, and Max is going to process, and it's going to give me this big cluster of a mess of UV coordinates going on here. And the reason why these aren't showing up in the viewport here is that we're displaying map channel 1 in the viewport, not map channel 2. But this is how light map baking basically works a lot of the time, is they'll just take the entire object, they'll break it down into planar thresholds, like I said, and they'll map them this way. You could do the same thing if you had to have like ambient occlusion baked in, and you can use your real world scale on map channel 1 and bake your ambient occlusion on map 2, and then use the rendering system inside of Max to combine and do some cool stuff with the materials, which is right up the alley of Bruno's rendering team. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay. So I'm just going to do this here. I'll keep talking. We'll go for another 10, 15 minutes if everyone's okay with that. Okay. So one thing that I've noticed as I'm working on my face here, I've got this kind of distortion going on here. So this is these pieces in here. And maybe I want to reselect them. So rotating around the mesh might be hard because I have to do a lot of selections. So what I could do instead is actually, I can just select the pieces from inside the viewport here. And I've got it going. Maybe I can do a quick planar map on it. So I've gotten this output. It looks flat because that's how the plane projection is. You can see the gizmo right there. It's mapping basically to this average of faces. But what I can maybe do here is maybe I'll just try the unfold mapping really fast to see what it's going to give me. Nope, didn't really give me anything that was too great. But at least it's unfolded. So what I might try to do instead, let's just undo. Maybe I'll just use the tools here, and I will just select these edges really fast. Let's convert them to a seam. And I'll reselect those faces again, and let's quick peel. And then now I get this nice flayed out piece for the interior here. And once that's done, it's maybe not pulling, the tension might be different on this face here. So I might end up just repealing and get a different result out of it. And so this is what I was talking about, where it could be really beneficial and useful sometimes to use, sometimes it just works out to build your UVs, and then it maybe makes it easier to make a selection out of what you want to have.
Yeah, so someone mentioned, I guess it's similar to this workflow, but if you place the top of the head back into the visor or something back into the helmet, are you sure you won't kind of scale and make some huge distortion? Just like if you put that small pieces that you just did and you want to put it back inside that.
Put it back in this hole here? Yeah. It's going to create a distortion. So let's say, if I want to take these pieces here, and I'm going to scale them down just to visually to eyeball it and fit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we get a problem, right, in that the mapped out pieces don't actually align to what actually exists here. So this might be one of those examples where you don't do it, or if you really had to have them in there, what you might end up doing is just how it was before, right, where there's distortion on the inside, and that's just how it's going to be. Yeah. Just because sometimes these things just can't. After you've inflated them, they're going to be stretched and distorted. So, for example, you know, if I was to map out the you know, this area right here with a quick planar map. So I've got it, and we can see that this is how it is here. But they no longer line up. The jigsaw pieces don't line up anymore, and this simply just comes down to how the flaying was done, right? I wanted to flay it so that it had minimal distortions, but that also means that the shapes now become irregular and don't necessarily perfectly line up once again with what goes on here. And this is where I was talking about that, you know, having a natural surface change, having a hard edge or an angle or something like that, or an overlap can actually come in handy for helping you hide these kind of seams where there's a distortion going on, because hard edges and overlaps, we just kind of naturally assume that terminations or differences between the pieces are just going to be naturally there, and that's just going to work out that way. So that might be a good way to consider it. So I'm just going to keep on going here. If I want to select these pieces here, maybe I might be lazy. There's this neat little grow option right here inside of Max. So I can grow my pieces, and it's going to let me make this selection right there. So I can do that. It's a quick planar. Just gonna shove it off to the side. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Piece here. Let's grow, select, quick planar. And then maybe I'll try peeling these guys out. Of course, it's going to reset to the middle. You know, and of course, once again, the distortion is going on here, right? So you can see the distortion where it's not quite lined up. This is a little bit more oval shape now, as opposed to the more rectangular kind of surface that it had. If this is really a big concern for me, and this is just how the algorithm was, it's also kind of skewed it a bit. I could break it up more, or in some cases, you know, if I can't fix it with the algorithms, I might just go in and fix it naturally, just using some of the tools to just realign it, rejig it to how it wants to go. Sometimes you might just have to do that because the algorithms are going to work the way that they're programmed to work. They're going to work with the data sets that they've got to work with, and that's just going to be how they are. You could fight with it, and you could try to, you know, readjust it and try again and again and again, but sometimes it's also just maybe easier to fix up, just do a fast fix yourself and make some adjustments and see what you can do to get it to look the way you want it to look, right? We also sometimes have this like mental perception in our mind of like how we think the model is versus how the computer and how the algorithms are thinking actually know the model is. And so we're kind of always trying to fight and balance between those two sets.
So I guess it's a bit related to when someone asked earlier to kind of combine or put on top of each other like similar UV islands. So somebody asked, is it possible to kind of like automatically put on top of each other's all the UV islands that are similar, so like similar objects like boats or nuts, stuff like that? Is there a way to do that like automatically, or you want to make sure they're properly aligned? And
that's a great question about that. Most of the algorithms don't really know. It's kind of one of those things you normally have to just like stack them on top of each other. What might work out best if you had all these various bolts to do, what I've done in a lot of projects is I'll have one bolt shape. So let's say if I've got just use a cylinder as a proxy for it. See if I've got that going. What I might do is actually, if I've got a bolt or a bolt head, 6 sides, yeah. What I might do is actually UV map the bolts or the bolt head or the screw head first individually. So it'd be really fast to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just gonna go with this, select this face here. Let's grow it one and get that. It's imperfect. So that's okay. Do the peel mapping. So we get the head and then the sides, which are a little bit off, but that's okay. What I might do is just UV map the bolt and then you know, stick it off in its little coordinate that it's going to operate for however size it needs to be. And then create more bolts by just maybe instancing them. And then
now they're gonna have all the same UV space, right?
Yeah, they're all gonna share the same UV space. That's probably the best way to do it. Because most of the algorithms, especially when they're packing, are they're trying to think that everything you want to do is explicit, right? So they're always gonna try to like separate your UV coordinates and do it and do stuff with it, right? So they're not necessarily thinking about like keeping them stacked together as a group. And that can be a bit of a problem. Same when you're doing like a generation, right? Sometimes what you can do if you had shapes that are similar to each other, just isolate these guys just for the sake of making it easy to see. If the shapes have been copied off of each other, so they're the exact same shape, so they're like a copy duplicate of each other, which means that the vertex order and all the data is exactly the same. What you can do is you can do a copy and paste of UV coordinates. So for example, I've got this here. Let's set it up so we've got that going there. You can copy coordinates and then do the same thing to paste them onto something else.
Oh.
Sometimes that works. So you see it actually pasted them on top of there. But it's only going to work because these are two shapes that were exact copies of each other. If I did like another cylinder, for example, and added it to the list, so let's make a third cylinder, this might actually fail.
Because of the vertex order or something, right?
The vertex order or something's out of alignment, that it's not exactly the same from when they were created.
Let's try, let's try.
Let's try. You guys want to see if this works here? Okay. So,
I want.
Yeah, let's go for it. Okay. So we're gonna grow, let's paste. No, it worked well. Okay. So it worked in this case, but sometimes what can happen is they just won't copy, or they look like they copied, but you look at the mesh and be like, what's going on with those UV coordinates? They're all distorted and messed up, right? Like beyond what's going on here, right? Like these are distorted down here because this these edges are tapering out, even though their faces are square, but in the UVs they're told to taper out, and that's why you get this kind of distortion going on. So this specific distortion right here is actually where the hidden edges for the polygon. So if we look, this is where the hidden edges. So it's distorting out because the data is just manipulating itself that way and fanning it out that way. But yeah, sometimes you think the copy and paste worked, but it didn't. So you do have to be careful on that. That sometimes it just doesn't want to. Are there any other questions coming in, Bruno?
There was one earlier about why I get deformed faces when using Stitch Custom.
Use Stitch Custom.
I think you used the Stitch Custom at the end at the beginning when you added kind of the lower part back to the back plate.
Yeah. So what might happen sometimes? I'm not a huge fan of these stitch options here. They don't really do what I want them to do for me. So for example, like if I'm using these other stitch options, like this one moves it, which I don't really want to have. What is this one doing? It's sort of doing the same thing. It's averaging out the pieces. This one's moving from the target to the destination. So these ones I'm not a huge fan of. Stitch Custom is kind of my favorite of the bunch. But what can happen with Stitch Custom, and this is usually the case I find if and when your UV coordinates aren't the same. So like if this shell is bigger than this piece and I try to Stitch Custom, what can happen is that you might get something like this going on where the target piece was smaller. So it's trying to move it, but it can't really scale it. So then it's trying to like stretch the pieces out on the end. What can also happen is if you've got some mirroring going on, I'm trying to remember where the mirror function is. So I've mirrored it, and we can see that they're backwards on the display here. So we're going from a mirrored to a non-mirrored destination. You can also get this kind of overlapping going on here. So it's just, once again, the algorithm is just trying to do what they think they should do in the order that they should do it in, right? So usually what I find works out really well is trying to, use the packing, at least on the two targets that you're going to try to stitch together. So I've got these selected, and I'm just going to use this custom pack together so that they become relatively the same size. This will help a lot more with the stitching. Also, maybe sometimes if we look at the distortion, sometimes it'll show up. Sorry, I got my override turned on. The area distortion can show up. I don't know if it's going to show for us here. No, it's not showing up. That's okay. But sometimes the area distortion will kind of influence whether it's mirrored or not, and that can help out as well. But it's definitely one of those visual things because it's not really telling you otherwise. If there's a discrepancy going on between the target and the destination.
And I think the best question we had today was from an anonymous person. I kind of mentioned that I was looking more as a Sean, and Sean was looking more as a Bruno. So if it was okay to kind of use each other names for, that was, I don't know how I feel about that. That was interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that one either.
Yeah, loved it.
I don't know if I turn my name into Bruno, people will start throwing too much work at my team. So I don't know about that one.
Let's take this one offline. I think there's a last one. So is there a way to use the alignment tools to align distant UV islands, but without changing their internal shape?
The alignment tools. Where am I looking for the alignment tools here? Sean, do you have any idea of the alignment tools that the user might be talking about?
Okay, alignment tools align distinct UV islands without. I'm not exactly sure what they're saying, but I think that they're trying to say if I without changing internal shape. Are you, maybe they're talking about the under the reshape elements, the one we did earlier. Maybe they're talking about that. Like straighten selection.
There are a few here, like there's a line horizontal, and vertical. These can be kind of useful, I guess. Like if I had one area where the algorithms can really mess up a bit is, let's see, we have this here. Sometimes you see, in the real world, you might have like shapes that are. You have these like corrugated kind of shapes going on. You might see them on like a power substructure and things like that, something like this. When you unwrap them, for example, so this is just a pretty simple cylinder to unwrap. When you unwrap them, for example, you might, I'll just map this guy, top, bottom, and then I'll just grab a edge here, turn to a seam. And then we'll flatten it out, and then we'll peel, right? So when you do this, you end up with this kind of like oddball accordion kind of shape going on here. And it's trying to best match what's going on at the coordinates here, right? But of course, the problem that you get, especially when you're trying to like texture this, is that now these coordinates are, they're all over the place, right? Like you can see the distortions going everywhere, the faces are starting to angle away, and then things like that start to happen for problems. And this is sometimes where people really like and want to have an option for like straighten selection. In this case, it works out really well because it came from a cylinder, but you might not have that luxury with it. So sometimes what I might just end up doing is the slow, painful way of just kind of using some of these alignment tools here to straighten my alignment out. It's not the best way to do it, and you can still end up with some distortions happening because it's trying to align to the average. But there might be situations that you find yourself in as a user where you have to align with something like this to get a straighter result that maybe is better for your sanity as a texture artist and things like that, right? So there's a few of them in here, but yeah, I think those might be the alignment tools they're talking about there. But yeah, and you can see like this is good for us as a texture artist. It does create some distortion going on in the model, but I guess it's gonna come down to what's better for your preference, right? Do you want distortion free, or do you want to keep the hair in your head, which is probably a good explanation for some of this baldness over here. Cool. Are there any other questions?
There's a last one. Is there a way to use the alignment tool? Wait, we just talked about this one.
that's
So that's it.
You can cover it again.
I forgot to press the answer line. We're done.
Yeah, I'm not sure we actually truly answered that question, but I don't think we have a direct way to actually do what they're specifically asking.
Yeah, I guess if you guys have any questions about the stuff following up, you know, we've got the area, we've got the Max Discord, we've got, you know, we're always actively looking on Facebook. If you guys are passionate about UVs and you got some questions about it, I know some of you were like, hey, you know, this tool frustrates me. You know, it certainly invites you to provide your feedback to us. We're always looking at this kind of stuff. It's actually my team that gets to be responsible for some of the UV work that's going on. So we are always actively trying to pull in feedback from you guys. If you feel that there's something that's not working as it should or the way you're expecting it to, please always remember to like report a bug report. And if you've got a passion for Max in general and wanting to kind of like move it ahead and provide some feedback and some value to it, we'd always love to have you guys apply to be on the beta program and check out what's in the R&D sections for it all and voice your opinion and get your feedback in early.
Great. I also have my kids asking when lunch is going to be ready. So.
Oh, when's lunch? So Amanda, we'll throw it. I guess we're at the end here. I hope everyone had a good time. The lecture hopefully was informative enough for you guys, and that I showed a little bit of what's kind of going on in Max, of how you might look at trying to do UV mapping. Like I said, it doesn't take too long. I know there's a lot of distractions and distortions. We went left and right with answering some questions and some tangents on it. But hopefully everyone got some value out of it, and it hopefully makes you find a little bit more love for UVs and a little more understanding and a little more success if you were struggling with it. So thank you, all of you, for being a part of this and asking so many cool and great questions.
Thanks for attending, everybody. Please, if you can take a minute, fill out the survey after closing this window. We're hoping to run more of these in the near future, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Hey guys.
Thanks, Logan.
Thanks, everyone.